Hello? So, today is just one of more of those little thoughtful times. So, first, I'm going to go over some thoughts I've had about some of the bits I've said. Nothing particularly earth shattering, I would say, but just little vignettes about things I've recalled that I have spoken about. And perhaps I should correct or investigate in some manner. Think about why I've said these things in this way, and so on and so on. And then tomorrow, I'm going to put a few of these videos out in the public for the first time. Nothing probably will happen. No one will read them. No one will look at them. It won't matter. And if anyone does say something, it'll be some troll who went over 30 seconds of a 2-hour video and spoke about that. Or it'll be some random person reading a bit of poetry, listening to me read a bit of poetry. And that isn't going to be a whole lot of people either, I imagine. But I will have done something. And I'll speak about that second. But for first, I spoke in one of the pieces, I think it was about in the racism book, you have to allow bad people to defend themselves in order to create space for movement and change. In the same way, you have to allow good people to defend themselves. Because it is very easy to look out on the mass of humanity and see hypocrites, thieves, idiots, fools, blind and dumb and mean and cruel. It's easy to think we know better than someone else, or we have suffered more, or we have a more valid experience. It's easy to think that those people who are good simply pretend to feel when what they should be doing is acting, or that people who are good, quote, unquote, and doing things are actually doing them for different reasons, bad reasons, selfish reasons, foolish reasons. They've been duped, or they want to make money, or they want to feel as if they are good. They want to feel in control. They want to feel as if they can look down on someone. They want to change the world, and it just so happens that the change they are fighting for is better for them and worse for somebody else. That is, I remember talking with someone, she was Chinese, and she was telling me that she thought it was very strange how Westerners, as she explained it, were willing to give so much money to charity. Were willing to give money away, that there was this constant call out and cry for you should spend 10% of your money as a tithe for the church, or you should donate 10% of your money for this cause or that cause. You have these videos about starving kids in Africa you grew up with as a child, and why is it so endemic in our population that we should give things away, that we owe the world something? And the way she looked on it was that, why would you do that? Why would you give money away if it wasn't for yourself? Right? Why would you donate money if you weren't getting something out of it? And so it wasn't entirely clear, what the feeling was here. Was it because, that is, did she think that folk who donated money and gave it away to charitable causes were hypocritical, or was it just an excuse to feel better about themselves? I mean, for example, I might give money to Doctors Without Borders, but I'm not actually a doctor myself. I don't actually train for that. I don't actually go overseas and find some struggling person and help them. I'm simply performing an action, speaking a word, giving some money away that's in a bank account, using a card that I don't really see. And I can tell myself that I'm a good person because I get a newsletter in the mail once in a while, or I receive an email, or I see something that reminds me, oh yeah, remember, I'm giving some money away. I'm being a good person. I don't have to change my daily life. I don't have to change what I do. I don't have to sacrifice or wish or do anything differently because I have absolved myself of my sins. Why? By giving some money away. I've tithed my percentage to the Church of Humanity. And there is a feeling of hypocrisy about that, right? That I should be doing something. If I want to make the world a better place, I should actually do something about that. And so, like, the claim, she was talking and she was like, oh, the claim that we should give money away rang false to her because she's like, why should I give my money away that I worked hard for? And not only that, but like, the Westerners are telling me that I should give money away, that I should sacrifice my hard earnings for somebody else. And this is suspicious. Why are you telling me to give money away to a cause that has nothing to do with you? The cause must have something to do with you. It must benefit you in some way. It was suspicious. It was hypocritical. It was weak. It was like, all this philanthropy. And I think part of the response in Western ethics to that, it's to a great extent a Christian ideal, but it also comes from the Romans and the Greeks, that if you are able to give your money away, if you can afford donating to the people, the state, if you can afford, supporting the polis, if you can afford putting in a, what do you call it, fountain in the middle of Athens, then you should do that. And this is how you become well known, but it's also your duty as a citizen, because you might be, and in the American idea, you might be the person who needs to drink from that fountain one day. You might fall down, you might lose all your money, you might be horrid. So if you want to vote for Social Security and you don't benefit from it in any way, it's also like a sort of insurance you take out on yourself using the state. You say, hey, I'm willing to sacrifice some of my power and my rights because someday I might be you. Okay? And sometimes we don't push that enough. We don't argue that enough. We don't explain that we're making you buy insurance with Social Security and paying for Medicare. We're saying that everybody is better off this way. We're saying that if you're found unconscious by the side of the street, an ambulance will pick you up, take you to a hospital, and treat you, no matter who you are or what you are. And there's a cost to having a society that exists like that. So oftentimes people will argue against social works by saying, this isn't for me, it doesn't benefit me. Why are you taking my hard-earned money and my hard-earned work and giving it away to someone else who doesn't deserve it, doesn't need it? And to an extent, we are. To an extent, yeah, you made a ton of money, and I'm saying you need to give some of that away because it's safer for you. Because if you end up with a society that is too top-heavy, where the poor have nothing and the poor are suffering and in terror and sick and have no money, then now you've got to spend your money on guards and guns. You've got to build castles. You've got to protect yourself. You have to worry about this. You have to push back against science and forward thinking. and scholarships and so on. You have to now control the world because you're in charge of it instead of simply coasting along with it. It's dangerous for society to have a too large distribution of wealth. It is dangerous for a feeling of philanthropy not to exist. Yet we also react to the critique of donations by saying there's something wrong with what I receive from it and what I want from it. Right? If I give money away to Doctors Without Borders, then do I not receive some accolade? Can I not tell people? Do I not get a pin? Right? Am I not on some list somewhere? Can't I feel that someone somewhere has noticed what I have done? Right? If I am a millionaire or a billionaire and I donate money to make a library or a train station or to pay off medical debt, then how should I react to that? Like how should I let my actions be known? Do I go and get the trophy? Am I standing in front of the news cameras saying that I've done this and this is a good thing? And when I do that, am I saying that I am good? I should be praised for having sacrificed my money where I didn't have to? Or am I saying that everybody should do this? That if you have the means, I think morally speaking, you should do something like this. And there's a part of us that wants to stay quiet and silent, right? Wants to donate to a church or give money to a homeless person and not say anything, because the whole point of giving the money away is to give the money away. And if I'm looking for accolades or praise, then I'm buying praise with money. If I donate money to give a scholarship to kids and I name that scholarship after myself, how arrogant, how desiring of immortality is that? Much more elegant to name it after a wife or a character or an ideal, you know? And I think there's something to think about in there. How do we give money away, and how do we justify that, and how do we react? It's a big, complicated idea. And I've only begun talking about it here. I haven't used any books or phrasing. I've just made up ideas in my head. And I don't really give away enough money to, donate a library or a scholarship or anything like that. Like, here's $5 for Nexus mods or something. And I can't really afford that. But, it's ingrained in my mentality. Hey, I'm getting something out of this. I don't have to pay, but I think I should pay, but I can't really afford to pay. Like, how do we run a society based on donations? I think it'd be interesting to talk to someone who was involved in that field. How do you solicit donations? How do you justify your donations? How do you make people feel the donation is used well? Do you tell people? Do you publish this? We have, if you go to the theater here in my city, in the back of the pamphlet they give you when you go to the play, it'll say donations given, and so and so and so, the $100 donations, $200, $500, $10,000 donations, and whatnot. And there'll be people's names and names of foundations and things. And, when you look at it and there's a $100,000 donation and it says the Andrew Carnegie Foundation or something, and you go, oh, they must give a lot of stuff away. Like, they're important and big. Look at how much money they gave away at this. But it's the same. You go to a school and there is a statue outside the John Wick Hall. There's a statue of John Wick or something. You go, oh, they must be important. They donated the money, right? Well, what if they didn't at all? What if it was the Blue Building and you had to look into old histories and old files to figure out who even gave the money away? Would that be better or worse? Do you inspire other people to give money away? Is that why you should pronounce how generous you are in your donations? After all, if no one ever stood up and said, I donated money, then no one would donate money, right? Or would just fewer people donate money? Or do more people donate money if you create this public pressure and morals? It's a question to ask and think about more. Okay. So next, code switching. I noticed sometimes when I was talking about racism, especially, I end up code switching myself into a ghetto speak or Ebonics. And it's interesting to do that because I may not be, how do I say, depicting someone else. That is, I'm depicting myself and depicting a version of me in my manner of speech. And I think there's a difference between like code switching when I'm trying to imitate someone and code switching when I'm trying to fit in, and code switching when I do it sort of accidentally, right? I might think that a certain part of me talks differently between different friends, right? If I'm with certain friends, I talk differently than I do with other friends. The words that come out of my mouth, my manner of speech, my general activity changes depending on who I'm around because I've established a relationship with them. When I'm speaking to a camera and I code switch, I'm then in a more interesting phase because I am connecting with myself and depicting this to myself, but also to the camera here. And I've noticed several times that one of the interesting abilities that I tend to have is that I can explain the same thing in different ways. There have been points where I've been trying to explain a concept to someone, and I give version A, and then version B, and then version C, version D, version E, version F, and then version G. Finally, they get it. And I've been saying the same thing all along. It's just that this was the method of communication that was necessary for this bit, to meet and match their mind to mine so that we could each in our conversation find knowledge and connection around the idea and not have to invent an entirely new way of speaking because I could use older methods in order to connect. So sometimes that's what I think I'd spend a lot of time doing. I have an idea in my head and I'm not even sure what I mean by it. So I'll try to say it in different ways and try to explain it over and over again. I'll try to meet and match it from A to B to C to D, or read a book and it'll come up over and over again. I'll read another book and another book and another book, talk to someone else. I'll read a manga, watch a show, and I'll go, oh, wait, that sounds familiar somehow, but I'm not exactly sure how. And I think oftentimes what I should do is slow down, wait, meditate, allow the ideas to flow into my mind instead of crowding them about, instead of tossing darts at a dartboard as fast as I can, hoping that two of them will match. Might be better if I talked to myself in my head, and I would probably achieve more instead of babbling like this for hours and hours. But each is a method. Each is a style of thought and communication. There are moments where I sit down in my bed and zone out for 45 minutes. Or I'll go to sleep. Then I wake up after taking a nap, and the ideas will work out in my head again. I'll snap my eyes open in the middle of falling asleep, go over and write down something and type a letter or a phrase or a sentence or a poem. And I'll go to sleep, I'll wake up, and sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. All those midnight thoughts we write down. And I wonder how many codes there are. Obviously, the ghetto speak and Ebonics and my regular method of communication are one way. But like for example, I noticed that when I become excessively anxious, I have a tendency to disassociate slightly and then to increase the vocabulary of my words, to utilize a more elaborate means of pronunciation regarding my speech so that my intentions, I hope, are more accurately conveyed. That is, I become formal when I am nervous, because it is a way for me to slow down my speech or enforce upon myself the slowing down of my speech. And these are just one way in which I act. Even when I was reading poetry the other day, I noticed some poems I sort of just blabber out of my mouth, and then others, they mean a lot to me, so I'm more invested in them. I feel more energy flowing through me. It's all about, I would say, a lot of it is about energy flow and how the energy flow of my thoughts is stifled or spread, is directed or alive or dead. And where and how we code switch, I think, is rather obvious in certain situations and who we're talking to, but it can also be interesting because it tells us how we think about ourselves. How do I have to act in order to fit in? How do I have to sound in order to relate to somebody? Why do certain ideas come out in a phrase in a phrase or with an accent or with an attitude? Again, there's a lot more ideas to get into there. And when it comes to investigating things like this, I think it's important to look at specifics, because right now I am philosophizing generally. But to actually understand what is happening, you need to look at it in a more, not necessarily scientific manner, but a more specific manner. These 5 phrases or these examples on screen. So perhaps one day I'll go back and look at some of my speeches that I give on camera where I code switch, if those are pointed out or if I can find them, and analyze those instances, try to understand what I was doing there, why I felt it was important to change my communication method or my accent or so on. Okay. Oh, stereotypes. I think I have utilized stereotypes quite often in my speech. Everything from, I made a comment once about rap music as if it was black music, but it's not exactly that. Same with hip hop isn't exactly that, especially nowadays. I think I once called Korea is the Ireland of Asia, is how it was explained to me. And if I'm making a business deal, for example, in Korea versus Japan, I'm going to act differently based on my understanding of those stereotypes. And stereotypes are interesting because there are reasons for them sometimes. There are reasons for understanding that within certain cultures, you have histories, you have common morals or methods or practices or codes, as it were, that work. And so you can say something indirectly, or you can communicate more effectively, or you can demonstrate your place in that culture by acting or reacting to a stereotype. Right? There's a reason that jokes about racial stereotypes or age stereotypes work, because we recognize that there is something there. Now, it's interesting, right? Because individuals oftentimes do not conform to the stereotype. It's just that when you look at 5 or 6 or 7 or 30 or 300 of these individuals, you try to observe what is in common, and you recognize, oh, this stereotype tends to be in common. You know, kids are wild, old people are gruff, so on and so on. And there's this balance always between understanding a person as a member of their culture and their identity in a group setting, and understanding that person as an individual. Again, another idea to look at in specifics. I think I gave... Oh, here. I was perhaps too harsh to my review of And Juliet. Right? Like my understanding of Romeo and Juliet is based upon the last time I saw Romeo and Juliet or read about it, and based upon my general understanding of the theory in the story. That is, I am not familiar with seeing it as a sort of mockery. I look at like the ages of Romeo and Juliet, and I go, well, that was like, what's the story I've been told, right? What's the story I know? Well, that was normal in those days. And then I read I was reading on Wikipedia or something, or it was on Reddit. I'm not sure. It was a commentary somebody had made when they were like, oh, Shakespeare knew that these ages were weird. You know, Shakespeare knew it was just a crush, and it was and Romeo and Juliet was just a commentary on how absurd it is to fall completely in love at the age of 13, so much that you're willing to kill yourself. And I'm like, okay, if you look at it that way, then And Juliet makes more sense. If you look at Romeo and Juliet as a satire, then And Juliet, the modern-ish sequel here somebody's written, makes more sense. And perhaps that's the genius of Shakespeare, that you can interpret several of his plays in rather complex ways. So perhaps I was too harsh. And maybe I should read Romeo and Juliet again, looking at it through a new lens instead of the serious way that I tend to see it. What if I look at it as a satire? How does it change my interpretation of it? And it becomes more interesting as well, right? Because how does that change my experience with it, or my self-reflection of my experience with the story going back 20-odd years? You know, I've known the story of Romeo and Juliet for ages and ages. And how has that affected my understanding of life and love and so on? Or of reading stories? And if I see it as a satire, then can I sort of review and revisit all my ideas about the Romeo and Juliet story? Perhaps that's another idea to look at eventually. Although I would want to, perhaps I could comment on some paper about themes in Romeo and Juliet, some PhD dissertation, after, of course, reading the original play again. Oh, then self-defense examples. I think I made an example of when a group of people who identify as themselves is under attack or under stress, they tend to find pride in who and what they are. See them as a means of self-defense. You end up self-policing as well. I think this was in the racism book, and I was talking about like the Black Renaissance in Harlem and so on. Where now you have to find pride in what you are. If the whole world tells you you're not good at all, then what's the reaction to that? You can abandon your history and your people, or you can say, let's double down. No. All the folk around us are wrong. We actually are right. We actually have something to be proud of. You know, we have Duke Ellington and so on. And this means something. I can look back at it and say, well, you know, yeah, slavery was horrible and terrible, but, you know, at least my people survived through it. And that is a strength of survival that we have shown for years and years and years. So I can look at the horrible abyss of this event and find some glimmer of pride in it. Why? Not because the event is good, but because I am descended from that event, and I need to find some pride in my life and my history. And it was in racial terms. But you could look at it in modern terms as well, right? Why is urban music, rap and hip hop so popular nowadays? Why was it popular in the first place? Because it was rebellion. Why was rock popular? Because it was rebellion. It was, hey, let us claim to be something else. Why were hippies popular? Why do hippies still exist? Because you can look back at the history and say, oh, we are linked to this idea, or especially with the hippie movement, right? We have a different way of looking at the world, and we can actually go back to like India and these ideas of yoga and karma and crystals and magic going back 1,000 years or 2,000 years, or we're rediscovering our Wiccan heritage, and it's based on these ideas here. It's not just modern, it's on old ideas before Christianity. And you can have a Christianity outlook and like, okay, I'm a little different, or our sect or our cult or our version of it is a little different, but let's go back to the Bible and we can base our pride upon that. And one of the ideas I was thinking about specifically was like nerd culture. I grew up during the tail end of the time period when nerds were a bit social outcasty, right? Like the tail end of the idea that D&D was devil worship. And it didn't really affect me directly, but it certainly affected the messages I heard and the movies or books, or some of the manga I look after. Even today, you have manga based around this idea of the otaku who stands out as weird, or the person who's secretly an otaku because they just want to be thought of as weird and strange. The jock who's actually a nerd, but don't tell people I play D&D, or don't tell people that I wear glasses, because I'm a pretty girl and I wear contacts, sort of thing. And so I'm part of a culture that sort of said, well, let us defend ourselves. Let us start to form anime conventions where we can act all sorts of weird. We can dress up as characters, and we can be ourselves among people who know who we are. And then you see someone who's a bit of a normie walking around and going, okay, you don't belong here. And you're happy to induct the normie, perhaps, but certainly this is a high school phenomenon, perhaps middle school phenomenon. You form cliques and groups and you defend yourself, and you say, oh, well, let me indoctrinate you into the ideas. Or there are esoteric arguments, Star Wars versus Star Trek, for example. Eventually, if a group takes pride in itself for long enough, then it comes out into the open and it is acceptable. Nerd culture today is a whole lot, anime culture, gamer culture is a whole lot more acceptable now to be way into that than 20 or 30 years ago that it was. And that is, to a large extent, due to the folk who have grown up, right? You have skateboarders, for example, and I don't think skateboarders are quite the rebels they used to be. That Tony Hawk is quite the exemplar of grinding the rails, staying up late, surfing down the streets of San Francisco in the concrete jungle, evading the cops sort of idea. And that's not a bad thing. That is the sign that the ideas and the activities for which you fought are more mainstream. It doesn't mean that you have lost your own pride. It means that your pride has expanded. It means that the world has expanded. And hi, cat. And so on. So it should be looked at as a good thing. But I think we also have to recognize that this can happen especially in the self-policing area, to be dangerous. Right? You want the correct nerd, you want the correct anime person, or you are a soccer player, not a football player, you know? Or especially in politics, you're left, but not the right kind of left. You're right, but not the right kind of right. And that is problematic. Because pride is powerful, but vanity can also be caught up in it, I think. The idea that now we have to not just be important ourselves, we have to make sure that other people don't call us unimportant. A sort of false pride that is not adequately based in history and action, but instead is used as a band-aid over the actual real wound. And again, more complicated question, perhaps better dealt with in specifics, but you can see a sort of push and pull between culture and counterculture in the idea there. Oh, here, I was looking at, we get into taxes, right? Corporate taxes versus personal taxes. And I'm thinking, well, you want, if I think I argued once for low corporate taxes, high personal taxes. But this could also be dangerous, right? Because then who is in control, who is in charge becomes the issue you want to look at. And so how does that change the way our system works? That an individual, instead of having $1 trillion, only controls a company worth $1 trillion. How does it change what they can or cannot do, or the effect they have upon the world? And perhaps we could look at it another way. What about ownership of a company? That is, if we tax corporations at low levels, but we disperse the ownership of corporations by taxing personal wealth at a higher level, thereby forcing people to dilute their ownership of the company by selling stock, then corporate taxes aren't too terrible, right? Because the benefits of that corporation growing are spread out. You also have the concept that a corporation is just tax withholding, right? That you could have your money in a corporation, that's just value you have not been taxed on yet. Therefore, you can hide your money in a corporation and still control it and direct it, what that money does, the political purposes it supports, and so on, while not actually owning any of it yourself. And that's an interesting concept to look at. You know, how do you really make income more dispersed while also increasing the benefit of wealth dispersion? That is there a way to make it sound as if wealth is being dispersed when actually it's not, when actually there's some sort of trick happening, some sort of interesting bit in the taxes? And something like this might come up when you look at, the book was talking about France and saying that, well, French wealth taxes are so-and-so, but actually they're much, much lower than you think they are, because the wealth taxes don't count X, Y, and Z. You know, they don't count unsold stock, or they don't count ownership in private companies, or they don't count the worth of buildings, right? Which would mean that if, for example, if it doesn't count the worth of a building, then someone who is a multimillionaire and owns a skyscraper would pay lower taxes than someone who is a multimillionaire and owns a factory. And that seems absurd. So the argument was to be very careful. We want to tax wealth in general, right? All the wealth of everything you own, not just certain pieces and parts of it, not just the bits which are politically acceptable, so that someone can say they have a wealth tax, but actually only 4% of their wealth is marked as taxable income or taxable wealth. And I think that's important, that if we see wealth as a problem and we want to tax wealth, then we need to tax wealth in every single form, not just the politically expedient ones. And when we talk about things like that, you have a sort of question of politics, particularly half measures or full measures. Now, there's an argument for each of these. If you aim to tax wealth in general, then you can start off by taxing certain kinds of wealth, certain types of wealth, and then you can slowly expand that over time. Or you can say, hey, I want to tax certain kinds of tax wealth, and instead of a half measure, we're going to affect a full measure. Now, the theory is that if we do it bit by bit, then this is more politically simple to achieve. But the other side is, if we do it bit by bit, then someone can say, well, you already tax wealth. And we say, no, we tax half of wealth. And they say, no, you only tax these wealth and that wealth, not tax these wealth. And all of a sudden, the sort of conversation gets muddled. It's like universal healthcare in the United States. What exactly does that mean? How does that affect what happens? What does the new system look like? Who benefits? Can it be fixed? Can it be changed? Is it a tax? Does the Supreme Court have to decide this? We don't really know what we're getting into. How much of the country is already under some sort of universal healthcare in Medicare because they're old and so on. Does that count as universal healthcare? Do they pay for it? To what extent do they pay for it? All of a sudden, you get into all the complications. Much easier to just say, here is my plan for universal healthcare. It will undo all the other healthcare bits we have, and this is how it will work from now on. And this is, I think, is better. Right? It's easier to push that idea instead of 1,000. We've heard about death by 1,000 cuts, right? What about building with 1,000 bricks? You could spend generations doing this. Much more effective, we would think, to just do it all at once, but much more dangerous as well, because if you're sweeping all the old stuff aside in order to erect a new edifice, what happens with the junk? You have to have a plan for not just changing over, but for dealing with the unintended effects of the change you are trying to make. Something else I thought of, but I didn't really go into much, was we offer tax breaks for certain activities, right? We say, if you donate money, that doesn't count up to a certain amount. If you donate money, it doesn't count as taxable income. If you save money in an IRA or a 401k, that doesn't count as taxable income. If you're paying off a mortgage or a loan of some sort, that doesn't count as taxable income. And all of a sudden, instead of being in a 40% tax bracket, you go down to a 12% tax bracket because you're taking advantage of all these loopholes. And I think there is a benefit for these loopholes, but we want to be very careful on them. And you want to have minimum taxes, a minimum level of tax that you have to pay on a certain wealth or income no matter what. Though this should, I would argue, be very low. 3-5% or something like that should be a minimum tax. But as well, we want to, think about the concept, right? If I'm saying you can give money, you can donate money away, then if that money is used for public good, that's just easier for everybody. The government doesn't have to take your money and distribute it through all these little systems. The individual who is donating the money doesn't have to watch their money, their cash disappear into a gaping black hole of the government and maybe be used for good things, maybe not be used for some things. Instead, they can look at their money and see where it goes because they know who they're giving it to. A smaller organization, much easier to look at and review. And it's easier for the public, instead of voting on all these things and who wants this and who wants that, you have a person who says, well, I want my money to go towards this, and so their money goes towards that. And if you want to donate to their charity, then you can do it. And then if everybody is donating to a certain charity or certain ideas about helping, the poor or the homeless or the mental or repairing roads or bridges or something, and this is just taxes more directly. This is just democratically more efficient than sending it to the government and then sending it out. And then, majority wins. Instead, it's directly, I, as an individual, am giving my $5 to so-and-so for this activity. Instead of trying to vote the government give more money to this activity. It's more direct. Now, you want to, of course, look at the charitable organizations very carefully. I've seen this in speeches and talks with people that they're like, well, so-and-so billionaire created a charity, but it turns out that their family controls that charity. And so it's just a means of hiding money, right? Because, well, that charity has to pay for flights for their executives and maybe housing in certain situations. The charity pays for a private secretary for the CEO of the charity. I'm like, well, yeah, there's a legitimate reason for that, but also you're going, okay, wait, the family donated money to the charity to hire a secretary for themselves, and now they don't have to declare the money that is sent to the charity, which is spent on their private secretary, as taxable income. So it's just money that benefits them. And if they had just paid directly, hired someone directly as their secretary, we would have taxed that income. But instead by making them go through this roundabout means that we allow them to evade taxes, that doesn't seem right. So you don't want a charity that benefits the individual who is in charge of that charity. And that's dangerous in that, how would you enforce that? Would you say, well, the charity can't be administered by family members of this particular person because they started the charity? Well, in 25 years, who knows what relationship they have with it? And if I'm starting a charity, for example, give me $10 million and I'll give $5 million to my mom and say, Mom, go be a philanthropist for the next 10 years. Give away $150,000 every year, travel economy to a few places in the United States and, enjoy your retirement and go to some fancy dinners. And I'd be like, the point is to give money away. The point is also, like, for my mom to have the enjoyment of giving money away, right? For my mom to have something to do. For my mom not to be bored. Right? And also, if I'm handing a bunch of money over to someone to give it away, it's going to be someone I want to trust. And maybe I trust my mother or my brother or a cousin or a friend quite a lot. So I think you are the person to give the money to, because I give it to a stranger, who knows what they do with it. And then I got to watch their money. I got to look at the receipts all the time, just to make sure that this charity is right and that nobody's stealing from the charity because I gave the money, so I feel somewhat responsible for it. And it's so much easier with a friend you trust. We've seen how that can go wrong as well, though, right? My parents stole a bunch of money from the charity. My brother was stealing from the charity. My friend was stealing from the charity. And lots of trouble there. Some popular trouble. And so, and then as well, I would say that I would say for taxes particularly that you would have that I would suggest a very high level of charitable exemptions, right? If you're going from 40% of your income being paid in taxes to 12% of your income being paid in taxes, but 90% of that gap is because of charitable donations you made, I'm totally fine with that. Because in theory, if those charities are legitimate, then this is money being spent for public good anyway. So it doesn't need to go to the government to do that. You don't have to spend money on the government for that money to be spent on a public good. And, theoretically, if you're donating, if you're putting money aside for an IRA or 401k, then this is good too, because you are inducing the public to save. And we want that. I guess it comes down to what degree is the money being siphoned off and used simply to benefit the individual person. To what degree is the difference in taxable income that is achieved? When you hear so-and-so company brought in $174 billion in revenue, or so-and-so company made a $17 million profit and paid $4,500 in taxes, you're going, something seems wrong there. When you hear, so-and-so paid $35 in taxes this year and they're a billionaire, you're going, that's wrong. Like, I don't know your finances, sir, but that's wrong. When you hear that the ultra wealthy are paying a lower level of percentage of their income as tax than the normal person, then you're going, something's wrong there. And you have the dangers of tax loopholes. It's much easier to have a minimum level of tax and just say, well, 10% of all wealth or all wealth is taxed at 1% no matter how rich you are. But that has its problems as well. Having no such exemption for charitable income could be a problem if you want to induce charitable spending. Or you could just say, like, we're going to set the taxes very low, but also very simple. This would require looking more at examples of tax evasion and how that is achieved for me to comment in a greater, more specific fashion. It's just something to think about here. Okay, so the next study I wrote about was, I think I talked about minimum guaranteed income, universal income. And the issues with that are manyfold, I think. But two of the main ones are A, income is generated through production. So you could theoretically, okay, so it's like the argument for universal income is that we produce so much, not everybody needs to work, we produce so much and so on. But it's also that there is such an income disparity, we need to equalize that. There is such a disruption of the normal working process or job growth process with AI or robots that we need to do something so that society doesn't collapse. But the point of the matter is that, someone somewhere has to do the work. Universal income is not a method to solve all ills. It simply says that each individual has a percentage or a part of national income, which is not the same as national wealth. Perhaps that's what I'm trying to get at, that if you use rent and spread it out as income, then how does that induce the creation of more wealth? Again, I can get into that once I read more about it. I'm just trying to think. I mentioned that once, and I think there's more to be thought about. The other idea, or the other possible problem, of course, is the free rider issue. That is, if you have a universal basic income, then there will be a subset of the population who is perfectly fine to live on that universal basic income and do nothing, and contribute nothing, and produce nothing, and act simply as parasites, or really, technically speaking, as owners, as absentee owners, particularly. That is, they intake their rent from their properties that they own as a citizen of so and so country, and then they spend that rent on their own living, but producing nothing in the meantime. Now, there are lots of people, I think, who, given a universal basic income, will choose to do something nonetheless. There are folk who will become artists, who will create, who will try to make a business so that they can be richer and not just live in the projects or on the dole. I think there are folk who will make music, who will read books, who will learn and study and research because they want to do something with their lives. But the sad truth is there are also people who will just do nothing. They will sit around in a circle and smoke dope. They'll sit in front of a TV and just flip through the channels 365 days a year. They'll sit down and play video games and do nothing. And there are some folk who will play video games and they'll stream and they'll entertain folk. There are some people who will flip through the channels and write critiques about them. But there's lots of folk who just don't really have anything in their life to live for. They don't have a goal or a dream or an idea. They just want to exist, eat, drink, have friends, have family, have people they know. And if all of society is mechanized, this is possible. If you have enough AI and enough robot workers that they can maintain themselves, then a universal basic income society, a post-capital, post-social realm is possible, but we aren't there yet. There's still so much work that we have to do to achieve it. And so I think the question is not whether universal basic income is good or bad necessarily. It may, in a more particular fashion, be at which point is it proper to introduce. I'm not sure that day is here yet. And so it becomes interesting, right? Because I can wholeheartedly agree with the idea and the hope, but I also understand the costs, and I think a more clear vision or understanding of what is necessary to achieve a universal basic income or to make it work should be looked at. Because it must be funded in some way. That is, resources must still be produced that are used up. At the very least, at the very, very, very least, right? You need to have a society that is moving towards renewables much faster than we are. Moving towards recycling ideas. Moving towards a more local self-sufficiency of production, 3D printers, things like that, as well as a more localized method of food creation or distribution. If when we're running on oils, when we're taking stuff out of the ground, when we have to use fertilizers on massive levels that we create using chemicals, then we still need to produce things. If we have a robot that can do something and then we have another robot that can repair the first robot, and a third robot that can build the second robot, and also build the third robot. I mean, also build the first robot. And so the second robot can repair, the first create, the third produce, and so on. If you have an equilibrium of resource usage, then I think universal income makes quite a bit of sense. But we aren't there yet. We're still having to work to survive. I'm sitting here in my room and there's books, there's computers, there's video games, and I can do something with this, but I would want to have solar panels on the roof, right? I happen to live in an environment where I can keep books in the garage because it's relatively dry here in California. But if I was in another place, if I was in England, for example, then I would need to climate control my room quite a bit more if I wanted to keep all this stuff safe and unmoldy. So one of the issues we have to deal with guaranteeing universal income, or really just any social services at all, is that there will be people who free ride off it. There will be people who are stuck on the dole no matter what. And how do we deal with that? Because guaranteeing housing for people is a good idea. It is something that benefits lots of folk. It is something where you can say, look, all the homeless have someplace to go. All the kids who are still stuck in their parents' house at 19, even though their father beats them, have someplace to go. These are very noble and I think societally beneficial ideas. But you will have people who just move into a house and they trash the place. And they're fine living in a dump, and you got all of a sudden, them making meth in the bathtub. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the free rider system? Do you create work requirements, but that has its own issues and problems, which I'm sure we can Google and look up about. But for example, it can push people off the system because they can't use a computer, or because the requirements are too onerous, right? I mean, how can you search for a job if you're spending 6 hours a day proving to the government that you're searching for a job, sort of bit? And I think there's two bits to look at. One is, how do we make sure there's not a free rider system? If you're having universal housing, for example, guaranteed housing, then I would say you make housing somewhat uncomfortable, right? You make you guaranteed housing, but here's your one room, your one little studio room that's, I don't know, 45 meters, 30 meters square or something. It's basically a jail cell, except you can lock the door and it's all yours. And you say, you do this because this is achievable. And you do this because the danger, right, is, oh, so-and-so gets a free house. And then I say, well, why don't I get a free house? Why am I stuck living in my mom's garage? When so-and-so gets a free house. Well, if you can say, look, he gets a free house, but it's not a great house. If I can say, look, living in my mom's garage is a better life than the free house I get if I was homeless, then I go, oh, you know what? Go ahead and have your free house. I don't want it anyway. It helps the political movement. As if we have the resources, then yeah, go ahead, take your free house that's a McMansion with 3 rooms and 2 baths and a front lawn that the state pays to be landscaped. Look, we have the resources to do that, and it doesn't affect me at all, and we're living on Mars or something. Go ahead. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where we have to pay and work for things. Now, it may be a good idea to guarantee housing because what's the alternative? People who are unhoused and all the problems that causes. But it has to be done in a way which is politically expedient and done in a way which understands there will be free riders off of this, understands there will be people who just get a free house and do nothing with it, and it deteriorates and collapses. You know, they get drunk one day and they bust up the windows because they're bored. This happens. People do this. It's not a lot of folk, but they exist. And so, you know, if it's a McMansion they burn down, that's a lot of resources. If it's a concrete block, it's basically a jail cell, a lot easier to repair. And no, that isn't nice to the folk who have to live 3-door room with their family. It isn't nice to the people who need space to pace. That isn't even very good for folk, right, who want privacy, for example, depending on how dense you have to build these areas. Because they might continue being interrupted by people coming into the garage and then leaving. But it's not just about what's right and good. It's about what is achievable with what resources we have. Okay, and secondly, I think I spoke of a priest not understanding who they are, but perhaps I could say like a priesthood not understanding who they are. I was referring to the Catholic issues with pedophiles in the church, right? And like one thing that the Catholic Church failed to come to terms with was what it actually was, right? The Catholic Church failed to come to terms with the idea that it may be a religious organization, it may be helping people, but it was also a clearinghouse for keeping child predators from being held accountable for their actions. It was a victim funneling system. And it's not enough just to say, oh, we're sorry. It's not enough to, once you're caught, decide that it was bad. You have to recognize that the very essence of who you are resulted in this, right? And you end up self-challenging yourself. This happens to any individual, and it's very difficult to do. To recognize that I was a coward or a fool, or that I did something bad to a child or to my sibling or to my friend. You know, it could be anything from the sexual perversions to just being mean to them, to beating them, to degrading them with your words. And then you're telling yourself all the time, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. Or I know I do some bad things sometimes, but on the whole, I actually do these other things, and I make up for it. I make up for beating my wife because I give money to charity. It's like, no. You have to recognize who you are, right? That you're using the charity, giving money to charity as an excuse for enabling your moral self to beat up your wife. And I'm like, it's not about good and bad. It's about the whole entire system, who you are. How do you act in this way? And why are you acting this way? And what justifications are you using in order to hide from yourself, from your own eyes? Okay, then another idea, I was talking about Islamic terrorism, but perhaps it may be more expedient to say like Middle Eastern terrorism. Or like to what extent is it colonial terrorism, right? To what extent can you blame the colonial outcomes for this, the colonial powers? Because you have terrorism in other means, right? You have, for example, communist terrorism. You have terrorism in Ireland over religious or self-rule issues. You have terrorism in the States inflicted upon the Native Americans, for example, or the settlers, And you also have like Christian terrorists in the States. In the name of God, I will purify so and so. You have terrorism in all sorts of places regarding drugs, for example. Don't try to catch the drug runners. Don't try to mess with the cartels, or else we're going to blow up City Hall. And so because the book I was reading was focused on Islamic and Middle Eastern terrorism, I wonder how much my understanding of terrorism is affected by that, right? Affected by how I grew up, the stories I heard, the ideas in the books I've looked at. What other books on interviewing terrorists are there? That is, in a more general sense, I have a limit of knowledge. Many of the things I say and the ideas I talk about and the things I mentioned about history or philosophy or peoples or cultures or nations are based upon my own experience or upon stuff I've read about. And there's lots of areas of the world I'm just not very knowledgeable on. I know a little bit about, I think, world history in general. But when it comes down to exactly what happened in Colombia in the 1980s, when it comes down to how the Iranian Shah was disliked, when it comes down to the transition between, the end of the Ming Dynasty and whatever came afterwards, when it comes down to what are the historical issues for the Rwandan genocide, I don't know a lot about these. So that's partially why I'm reading, right? To slowly expand my knowledge and slowly enter into a situation within my own self where I feel more confident speaking out on issues. I am aware that I'm ignorant. I'm aware that I don't know much, but I'm also aware that I could spend the next 100 years reading and there would still be something I didn't know. There would still be so much I had forgotten. I mean, the number of things I've forgotten about the history of Japan is gigantic because I read it in a manga somewhere, or I watched an anime and it mentioned this idea or that person or something or other along those lines. And I intook it, understood what was being talked about during the momentary point in time that the manga was talking about. Or I got the joke from, oh, this person just happens to be named Kenshin. Oh, I get it. That's funny because it's a reference to this. Or this is obviously a claim on the Legend of Momotaro. Something, and I get it. But then I go, okay, I don't really understand all of this. It's like the journey to the West, right? I know about the story of Monkey and Tripitaka, but I'm also not like super involved in every bit of the story. Right? It hasn't entered my mentality. Whereas,
you enjoying your birthday, man?
Yeah.
Damn.
One second. That's life. Okay, well, whereas when it comes to American history, I'm more deeply involved in it, so I feel relatively confident about speaking around those ideas. Philosophy, my studies. when it comes down to anime culture, I'm like, oh, I can speak about that. When it comes down to the history of Western Europe or colonial effects in Middle East, when it comes down to I don't know, Native American bits, I could go on and on. And as soon as I say something, I realize, oh wait, there's all stuff I don't know. Like I was watching an anime today, Princess Resurrection, and I sort of remember the name, but I don't really recall what it's about. I never really watched it, and I go, oh, so it's an entire subculture I didn't really get. When we look at VTubers today, I'm like, okay, I know the names of a few VTubers. My brother will show them on his TV screen once in a while, but I don't really understand all the references and ideas. I guess Hololive is something, and there's different generations and so on. Even when it comes down to BTS and Korean pop, I've heard the names, I've sort of imbibed some of the information, and then as soon as I say something to someone who actually is involved in that culture, I recognize my own ignorance. This happens all the time and every day and everything I do, and it's a struggle to deal with as someone who isn't that confident to begin with, to realize that I am going to be wrong, I'm going to be ignorant anytime I say anything, because I'm simply not an expert on I'm simply not an expert on the majority of topics I'm going on about. I'm just speaking and thinking out loud, and so to end, it's like, why am I thinking out loud? Why am I going to post these videos online for probably no one to hear or care about? It's because I want to feel that I can speak more. I want to improve my ability to speak extemporaneously, but also improve my confidence to know that if I'm entering into a conversation or I'm asked about a topic, that I can go on and on and on about it, that I can pull up something from my lips and my heart and my brain, my mind, my soul, and show it to people and say, this is something I think or feel or believe. And instead of simply sitting in a chair, being quiet, going, I don't know what on earth I'm going to say, the more I learn, the more I express myself, even just to a camera, even just my room, the more I feel like I'll be able to speak when I want to speak. And in particular, the more I say that I know is wrong, that I know is incomplete, the more I enter into a conversation and I say, I will allow myself to be wrong, to be foolish, to be misunderstood. I will allow the world to be such that others can misinterpret me, that others can comment on my speeches and my ideas and my actions so that I can read them, and then I myself am able to review others' words and contemplate and philosophize around this without diminishing who or what I am, right? That I feel like I'm a very cowardly and weak person generally. I am very low on energy. I get very anxious around crowds. I get nervous with people I haven't known for very long. I can shut down in emotionally intense situations. I tend to be quite worried and anxious. I can be pensive and rude and annoyed and quiet. I can be inside my own head a lot of the time. I don't actually do much. But what I am. And so this isn't about you exactly. It's just about me and improving me. There are many ways to improve me. I could work out, I could become richer, I could get a better degree, but I think that right now, if I think about what I most regret, what I most worry about, it is my communication and my speech. There's a saying, there are worlds enough and time for all the someone may wish to do. And you have that that idea from Marcus Aurelius as well. I've died, and this is my new life. What will I do with it? There are 1,000 things and opportunities in the world, but for now, this is the one I've chosen because I feel that I can do it. I think that I'm going to release some of these videos tomorrow for the first time because this is day 50 something. And so I feel that I've proved to myself I can continue doing this. It's like the books I write, the poems, or the art I do, right? I've done it for long enough that I can feel confident that I can continue doing it. I'm not going to just stop because I was hurt or harmed or laughed at, right? That I'm not going to just sit there quiet and silent and hating myself again. And, there's better ways to do this. There's more perfect actions to take, but for now, this is what I've got, and I'm going to do it without a break.